In this video, we'll cover API security. We'll talk about the types of APIs, how APIs work. We'll talk about some common vulnerabilities in APIs, and we'll do a live demo of building a simple API that accepts users and retrieves users based on user ID. And we'll talk about the benefits of API gateways. In part of the demo, we'll also demonstrate how it's important to put an API behind an API gateway to help you with the heavy lifting of handling things like authentication, authorization, and certificate management, and so forth. Stay tuned. API security. What are APIs? APIs are application programming interfaces that are essentially a set of rules and definitions that allows different components of software systems to talk to each other or exchange data. It enables easy integration and interaction between the various components of these software systems or services. What are the types of APIs that we have? We have REST APIs, SOAP APIs, GraphQLs, and gRPCs. In REST API, HTTP is the standard method for communication, and we use things like get, post, put, delete, and the focus is on the stateless representation of data. An example of an API, a REST API, could be something that simply handles like users or user data, and typically the type of data that is exchanged uses JSON format. In SOAP APIs, the protocol is primarily concerned with structured information in web services. So the difference between REST and SOAP is ideally REST typically communicates with similar APIs, but in SOAP, this provides a standard way of communicating with different services that actually are built from different architectural systems. So in using like a standard XML format, these kinds of data can be exchanged between different APIs that are built with different architectures and so forth. In GraphQL, this simply allows clients to request specific data with flexible queries and often through single endpoints that supports real-time data and fetching. An example of a GraphQL could be a social media platform that allows you to query users and user posts and so forth. And in gRPCs, which is more of a specific implementation by Google in terms of APIs, is a high-performance RPC framework that uses protocol buffers for serialization and supports bidirectional communication. These types of APIs, we typically refer to them as streaming APIs because they kind of communicate asynchronously and can exchange data in real time. An example of a gRPC API could be a microservices architecture that defines things like user services and has methods such as creating users, getting users, and so forth. How do APIs communicate? At the core of API communication is HTTP traffic. HTTP, the standard communication for most web applications and processes and so forth. We do typically see APIs implemented using HTTPS for an added layer of security, and an API communication usually happens in the form of a request and response. In the request response cycle, we tend to communicate via that API through a dedicated API gateway or an API endpoint. You can see like in this example, we have something like an HTTP api.example.com/users. As I mentioned, we use typical HTTP methods such as get, post, put, delete, and so forth. And you'll find a lot of headers, a lot of HTTP headers within these requests and responses. The most common one that you'll find will be content type, which typically defines the kind of communication data that is used. If you remember or you recall in the previous slide, I mentioned in SOAP APIs they use XML and others use JSON. In the content headers, you typically define what kind of data that you're exchanging between these APIs and so forth. And in our responses, we typically get responses that indicate whether whatever action we are trying to complete or do against this API endpoint either worked, did not work, malformed responses, and so forth. So you get the typical HTTP response codes, 200 indicating everything is okay, 400 bad requests, 500 internal server errors, and so forth. And we get the same thing Once an API responds, they will typically respond in the same data type or content type. As I mentioned, you'll see whether it's JSON or XML and so forth. One of the key features of APIs is how it handles authentication and authorization. So most APIs are designed and should be designed to verify the identity of the user of that system. A lot of them are typically done via API keys, or they're done via OAuth tokens or JWT tokens that are used as authorization mechanisms to determine if that endpoint or user or other servers or program that is requesting access to this API should be given that access or has authorization to do so. What are some API features that we can implement? We can implement things like rate limiting. Rate limiting ideally usually is meant to prevent abuse of our APIs in the request in the form of, say, denial of service attacks or denial DDoS attacks. These API rate limiting features set request limits either per minute, within a certain time frame, and so forth. A lot of APIs are designed to either block traffic from an IP address that's requesting certain number of traffic or within a certain period of time. APIs are also capable of caching, where this is meant to improve our API's functionality, whereby commonly requested type of data is cached somewhere within our system to avoid having to hit the API consistently or directly, and it reduces the load of access to the API. And then we have versioning, which typically handles and manages changes and updates to the APIs. In this feature, the idea is to avoid the disruption that we will typically get if we're consistently trying to render our API down just to do an update or improve certain parts of the API. We can talk about things like applying modular development in terms of the APIs, where we can update modules of our APIs versus doing an entire upgrade of the API itself. And then in documentation, we simply provide documentation for either other systems or end users who are either trying to use or utilize our API. So this is where we'll define how do you request this data, how do you get that data, how do you post data, how do you write to this API, and so forth. Now, one thing I do want to mention though is all these features I mentioned, whether it be it the authorization, authentication, and so forth, a lot of these, one of the things you'll find that we'll do in this video is we're going to talk about an API gateway. An API gateway is designed to handle these things a whole lot better than if we actually have to code this or implement this within our API itself. Now, that said, there's always the added benefit of, say, putting your APIs behind an API gateway to provide that additional layer in terms of a defense in-depth approach to minimizing these things that we are concerned about, such as abuse of our system, caching, and handling authentication, authorization via certificates, and so forth. Let's talk about common weaknesses in APIs or common API vulnerabilities. Broken level authorization is one of the biggest weaknesses that we see when it comes to APIs, whereby attackers can exploit weaknesses in your core implementation of access control, such as authentication and authorization. Mitigations against these typically involve implementing strong access controls and checks for most actions within your API or against your API, especially for sensitive calls, such as when it comes to deleting or removing things and so forth within your API calls. Rate limiting is another issue that we see, whereby attackers abuse our lack of implementation of controlling the amount of requests that gets sent to our API, and therefore this creates a potential for denial of service against our APIs, rendering our API inactive and unavailable for our legitimate users. Mitigations against these always include implementing rate limiting to restrict access within certain time frames. We can talk about injection attacks as well, where attackers inject malicious code through our API inputs. Mitigations, as always, includes validating and input sanitization and ensuring that we use prepared statements when it comes to manipulating data within our backend databases. Data exposure. where we actually unwillingly expose sensitive data through our APIs, and that involves data that shouldn't be out there, where an attacker can abuse some of the flaws in our APIs to actually retrieve sensitive data that shouldn't be retrieved. Mitigations against this involves proper data masking, encryption, and access controls as always, and then security misconfigurations, which tends to be one of the biggest things that we see as well when it comes to implementing APIs, whereby we do not configure our systems or our infrastructure to handle these API attacks, and simple things like misconfigurations can render our entire API and applications unavailable and susceptible to malicious attackers. Mitigations against these usually involve regularly reviewing and update our security configurations, setting the right permissions, access controls, controlling who has even access to configuring some of these APIs and so forth. One of the things I did mention, and I will talk about it again as we talk about API gateway, these tend to be built to handle a lot of these and remove those heavy lifting from us, so we can better implement our API and focus on the functionality of our applications and APIs. In our next part of this video, we will actually cover a demo where we'll build a simple API using Node.js and MongoDB. We'll test API functionality by simply sending it a request to write a new user into our API in our backend database, and then we'll set up an API gateway with Kong to actually test out what it means to route your traffic through an API gateway versus your API trying to handle some of these heavy lifting things. For additional resources on API, please refer to these links. OAuth continuously tries to do an amazing job and does an amazing job at providing some resources in terms of securing your APIs and so forth. Please follow these links. Go to the OAuth website. There's tons of resources to help you out, and I added the Kong documentation as well, just to point you out to the API gateway that we will be using as part of this test demo. So when I come back, we're going to go into our Windows box and set up our APIs and Kong and so forth, and we'll test the functionality out, and I'll see you right in about 10 seconds. So we're back in our Windows box. I'm going to open up Chrome, and then I'm going to search Node.js. And then we're going to download Node.js and install that. So let's give it a second. We'll open up our file, run it. Let me minimize that. Next. Accept that. Next. Next. And just take the defaults, and then we're going to install it. Install. There you go. So accept that. Add some permissions. That finishes up. It's running. Just take us a couple of minutes or a second. So that's done now. Awesome. Now let me open up a couple of things. Let me open up command prompt, and then we are going to check to see that our installation worked. I'll type node tag v, and then we get the version number. You can see that 20.13.1, and then I'll check the package manager as well, and I'll do version, and you can see it's 10.5.2. Awesome. So that looks like Node.js is fine and it's installed and working fine. So now let me install MongoDB, and we'll open up Chrome as always and search MongoDB download. Click the first link, and we'll just download the Windows version, and let's wait for that to finish up real quick. That's done. We start our installation, and it's running as always. Hit next, accept that, next. install, and we are good to go. It's installing right now. So same thing, grant the permissions needed, hit enter, that is done. It's running, we'll give it some time, it's running. And that installation is done as well. And then we'll keep going. So Compass is like a graphical user interface that we can use to sort of check our MongoDB databases. I'll close that out. Let me hit finish. And let me hit start. And as you can see, this is the address to our local Mongo host installation. So you see MongoDB localhost and the port number over there as well too. And if we hit connect, it will just connect us to the local host. And at this point, we just have some system databases in there. So nothing to see there. We're going to actually do a lot of the things that we're going to work in command line. So, but just, yeah, to point that out, this is our local DB connection. I think I closed that out. If I hit connect again, it will open up. But I'm going to open up command prompt, as I mentioned. And then we're going to type Mongo. And as you can see, it's not working yet. So we do need to do a little bit of some prerequisites. I'll open up services to check if it's actually running. I can see the MongoDB service. Let's search that MongoDB server. It's running, so it's not there. I think we actually have to check environment variables. So let's open that up. Let's edit environment variables. Go to path, edit, and then we need to add the MongoDB bin directory into our path. So I'll go that, search that, program files, MongoDB, add the bin folder, and we should be good. And hit OK. And OK. And now when I go back to command prompt, when we type Mongo, this should be all working and good. Still complaining. MongoD, there you go. That was the actual name of the program. So yeah, so that's working. So MongoDB is set up as well too. Perfect. I'm going to open Chrome, and what I'm going to do is navigate to the local host. It should give me an error saying it can't get something because we're just essentially pointing to the wrong thing. But I'm going to install MongoDB shell for now, actually, because we do need that to be able to run our commands on the command prompt. So that's also gonna a downloaded file. I'm gonna navigate into that file, and then I'm gonna grab the bin directory. I'm gonna copy those two files, place them in the program files on the MongoDB bin directory, and then we should be good to run the MongoDB shell. So I paste that in there, hit continue, and we are good. It's copied. So now those two files are in there. We're good. Let's close that out. Let's go back. And then let's close that out. Close the browser out. Go back to command prompt. And when I run Mongo shell, both should be good. So Mongo sh. Now you can see that it's working. It's loading up. There you go. Awesome. So now we're in the Mongo shell. So that's good. Close that out. And now I'm going to open up command prompt again, and we're going to actually work on setting up our API itself. So I'll make a directory under documents, call it API security demo. And then I'm going to go into that directory. We are going to create an index file. Actually, let me initialize this directory let me initialize this first. That looks good. All is initialized. Now I actually need to set up an index file, which now I need to actually install some libraries first. My apologies. We'll do the library installs first, and then once we're done, I'll set up the index file as well. So these are the libraries that we'll need. So I'm setting these up. Everything's run. It ran fine. Closed out. We can see that highlighting those parts. That's great. Okay, so we do have our packages and libraries installed. As you can see, what I am going to do is actually work on our API, and ideally what we usually do is create like an index file. What I'm going to do though is open up PyCharm, and then I'll create a new project. I just need an editor to do that, so I'll just call it other and Node.js. There you go. And then I'll just call it our API demo app, and I just need an index file to create that. And then I'll open new, and then I'll do file and call it index.js. And what I'll do is import all the things that we'll need. So constant express. So these are the packages we just installed essentially, because we'll be using them. So and what I'll do, as always, I will go offline, finish up this code, and come back, and we will work on the remaining parts. So bear with me as I go offline real quick, and I'll finish this code up, and when I come back we'll work on these. And I'll explain the code as usual. I'll be right back. Hello and welcome back. Our API is pretty much done. The code for our API is pretty much done. I'm going to spend some time and walk through it at a high level to explain what we're doing here. Please disregard the name up here that says AP Demo App. This was just a project name that I created in PyCharm just to be able to use the IDE to create this, to write out this code. So as you can see, we actually did create our API application here, and we called it API security demo, just so you can, I wanted to highlight that. So for disregard this part of it, this is just so I could pretty much run the IDE to be able to make the code right and easier. Now that said, you could use PyCharm if you wanted to use this folder, and then essentially when you come to initializing your API, you could do that against that folder as we did in here. So notice that I had gone into my documents and created a folder, and then I basically initialized it. But you could have easily done that by going into that folder if you wanted to go that way. But I'm just going to eventually copy this code and paste it in an index.js file in our actual application that we created. That said, at a high level, this API is a simple demonstration of a user data management system built with Node.js and MongoDB as the backend database. It includes an endpoint to create a new user and retrieve user data by their ID. The API also includes rate limiting to prevent abuse by limiting the number of requests a single IP address can make within a specified time window. I believe we set this at 10 minutes for now. Additionally, just so you are aware, this API is actually initially vulnerable to a common security issue known as broken object level authorization, which we will demonstrate and actually mitigate in the end. In the subsequent parts of this video, we'll actually also be implementing an API gateway, which is an additional layer of security that is recommended for APIs and provides another layer of security for APIs in the wild. So that's it. Let me go ahead and walk through the code just so we can understand what we're doing here. So over here, I'm simply initializing constants. Express is a web framework for building REST APIs. Mongoose is the object data modeling library for MongoDB and Node.js. Body parser is the middleware that we're going to use to parse our incoming traffic or request bodies to be handled by our API. And the rate limit is basically the library that we're using to handle the rate limiting that I mentioned just a few moments ago. So in this part of the code, we're simply initializing our application. We're using Express, so we're simply initializing our application here. Over here, um, we're calling the body parser. We're initializing body parser as well. In this function, we're simply connecting to our database, our MongoDB database. Just so you're aware, if you did install on a different machine, or if you're pointing it to an existing MongoDB installation that you already have for this testing, you will want to actually change um, this connection string to point to the right database that you actually are using. Over here, since this MongoDB database that I installed is on this local box that I'm testing with, this will just remain the same. In this method or function, we're defining our user model, and we're basically saying, hey, we want a username and some data associated with them. So this will be a username and some data associated with them. In the next method, where we're applying our rate limiting function, we're basically saying, let's check for within a 10-minute range if this user or IP address has been hitting this API more than 100 times. We'll tell it, hey, you need to wait. You're getting too many requests from here, or we're getting too many requests from you. In this method, we actually are making this. This is basically where we are calling a user, or we're retrieving a user. So this get method is where we're calling a user based on their ID. As you can see, this part is ID. This is where we are vulnerable to that broken object level authorization that I mentioned. Ideally, in the wild, this should be checked against any call to your API, especially when it's sensitive calls, should always authorize in terms of checking authorization permissions before actually processing whatever request that's sent to the API. But in this case, as you can see, we're simply just allowing it to do this. We'll be fixing that, as I mentioned, to demonstrate how these things work. But as I mentioned, we are essentially checking what API flaws we have in here, but we will also be adding Kong, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of mitigate for some of these things that we are talking about. Post, this is our post function. This is basically where we send a post request, and essentially adds a new user into our database. And this is pretty much straightforward. We take a user and add them into our database. Over here, we're defining a port number that we're going to be using for our API. And in this case, we're defining port 3000 for that. And then app.listen port, we're basically initializing our API here to start this API. So let me copy this, and I'll paste that in our text file, or I'll paste that in our actual application, and then we'll take it from there. So let me copy that and go to, I can actually move that file. So let me move that file real quick, and then we'll do that. So let me do that. And then I'll go to documents, and what I want is users, SPC, go to the user, go to users, create documents, and this is it. So I'll come back here and then just grab that file. I'll just copy it. Go back there, users, create PyCharm project, demo app. I'll copy that. And then I'll paste it in our API. Paste. So this is all set up. So our API is set up. When I come back, we'll go into the command line again, and then we'll start testing this API out. I'll be right back. Now that we've moved the file, which we can see here, index.js, I'm going to minimize this. I'll close this out since we don't need it anymore. And actually, let me just minimize that as well for now, but we don't need that. So I'll keep to the command line, and let me clear our screen. And because I actually already initiated this application, but I'll just do it again just so we can be sure that everything is fine. So I'll do npm init attack y to start up that API again, and we're good. And then I'll clear the screen. And then what I'll do is start the application by simply hitting node index.js to start off the application. And we should see that it says server is running on port 3000. So what I'll do is I'm going to open up a web browser just to test out that the server is actually up and running. This shouldn't give us anything back. It should actually complain that it can't get something. But I'm just going to go navigate to it just so we can see that, confirm that this is actually indeed working. So I'll go to that, and we're using localhost because we're on our actual computer, the same computer or workstation that this server is running on. And as you recall from our code, we had port 3000 where we wanted the application to run. So I'll hit enter, and as I said, it should say it cannot get. That's because we're actually not passing it any valid command. So I'll close out this browser, and we're gonna come back, and what I'll do is I'll open up a different command prompt, and I'll just do this, and we'll open up a different command prompt because this is where we are actually going to run our commands. I just want to leave this up here slightly so you can see the things like we should see traffic come in and back and forth as we kind of interact with this and so forth. So to start off the application, what I did actually start the application node index.js. So to query this API, you can either use Postman. You can have Postman installed. If you don't have that, just Google Postman and you should have that. In this case, since I'm running command line, I'm just gonna resort to curl. Curl is an application that is able to pretty much do all the things that we want to do here in this API demo. You can use curl to navigate to sites and APIs and all those things and make calls as you want. So I'm just gonna default to curl so we can make it a little easier. So what I'll do is, and if you don't have curl installed, you'll have to get that installed for your version, whether it's Linux version or Windows. Nowadays they come typically mostly installed already for some of these, so you should be fine if you don't. But if you don't, you can simply just Google how to install curl, and it should be fine. I'm gonna use curl, but you can use Postman as I mentioned. So let's go ahead and set this up. So curl, which is essentially the command, and I'm gonna do attack X, which is telling me that I want to do a post to this API, and then I'm gonna pass it a header, and essentially the content type that I want to give it is JSON content type application /JSON, because what's happening here, and I'll explain this command as we once I craft this command, I'll explain this. So I'll do that, and then I'll give it username, and then I'll just call it test user. Let's just call it test user. And then what I'll do is comma, and then data, comma data. I gotta put that in parentheses, in quotations as well. And then I'll just pass it some test data. And then I'll close that and close that as well. Close that as well. And then what I want to do now is actually enter the URL. And I'm going to make this bigger, just slightly bigger. Oh, let me do this so I can do that. There you go. So we have this bigger and we have this smaller. So this is a different command prompt. Just take notice of that. So finish the command, http:// localhost 3000, since that's the port we're using, /user. That's what we're calling the API. And I do have to escape this, I believe, because of this command line. So let me do that. Let me escape that. Do start from here. Just so it can actually grab that and interpret that as the quotes that we want it to be. So let's do that. Go to data as well. Escape that. And once I hit enter, we should see a new user added with the name test user and some data as test data. So let me hit enter and we see what happens. It still didn't like my curly brace. Something was going on there. Let me redo that. And let's hit enter. And you notice we did get a user added, and you can see it over here. So it says username, test user data, some data ID, and that's a long ID. So what we are going to do is actually call a user element, a user. We're going to call the API for a user, and this would be the ID. So let me grab that, copy that. And this time, what we are actually going to do is simply navigate to that URL again. We'll do curl. And since this is a simple get request, because we're calling something, we're not going to pass it any explicit HTTP method. We'll just call localhost. We'll call localhost again. And the same port 3000 and call user. And then this time we pass it the user ID. So if I pass it, I should get this data back. It should say test user and then data, some data. So let's hit enter and there you go. You can see that. So our API is working fine and this is working great. What I do want to test though is our rate limiting. So what I'm going to do is actually open up PowerShell just to do a little bit of some. We'll just do just a little bit more in terms of what we want from here. So I'm going to basically create a for loop that we're asking this API to give us multiple users, like over that number of times that we want. And we're going to pass it like 1,000 just to make sure that we can trigger that rate limited. So I'll do for, and then we're initiating our parameter 0. I equals, I am 1,000 and then I plus plus. And then we'll open that and then we'll do curl http:// localhost again and port 3000 user, and we're going to call that same user ID that I had from here. So I'll just right click and put that and we should be good. And then what I'll do is I'll hit enter and close that curly braces. So what I'm doing here, just to explain this command as well, is I'm basically saying, hey, I want to query this thing up to like 1,000 times and see if it would actually trigger that warning that we had. And in fact, this was meant to be 1, not L. So there we go. So when I hit this, we should get an error that says, hey, like you're querying from the same IP over this many times. You're not allowed to do so, because we actually implemented some rate limiting. And rate limiting is a good way to minimize like the potential for somebody to DDoS your API basically. But as I mentioned, this is not as effective as putting it behind something like an API gateway, which will handle all of those a lot more better than actually implementing it. Now we can talk defense in depth, where you can have this implemented within your API itself, and then also behind an API that would give it additional protection. So once I hit enter, we should get that message pop up. But let me do that, and then we'll check. What did I miss? Let me redo that. Paste anyway. Whoa, what happened there? It did not like it. It's requesting over 1,000 times. Quite a. What I'll do, actually, that for some reason that turned out weird. Let me do this. What I'll do is I'll make it into a batch file, and maybe we will actually run this file. So let me create a new batch file, and it's the same thing. So I'll do that. Let's do this. We don't want anything. So add echo off, and then for ampersand a. So this is the same command. We're just doing this in a batch script. So I'm basically saying, hey, I want you to call this several times. Curl http / localhost port 3000, call user, and we still have that. Let me copy that here. Where's that user ID? And I'll put it in there. And then we simply close that. Sorry, parentheses. Close that. Okay. And then I'll save this as rapid request or something. I'll just save it on the documents. I'll put it in the actual documents. Rapid request, something like that. .bat. And now, since I have that saved, I will minimize that. I'll go back to users documents, and then let's do this. Actually, just to make this a lot better, let me open another command prompt. And then what I'll do is I'll make this smaller, put that here, grab that now. That's the PowerShell. I don't want that. I want this actually here. So I'll put that here and continue to leave that there. And then what I'll do is we're on this window, the one in the bottom. So what I'll do is navigate to documents, cd documents, and then I'll find that rapid request.bat. Basically can just run it. So rapid. There you go. So I'll make this bigger so you can see. Too many requests. Please try again. Too many requests. It's actually kind of dizzy. Making me dizzy. So I'll minimize that. And you notice that's the error we're getting because it's complaining that we're running this too much. So you can see the message here. It says, too many requests from this IP. Please try again. Too many requests from this IP. Now think of it from a security perspective, right? A malicious user could just simply run this. They're not actually trying to get any data from your API. They just want to overwhelm it and shut it down, which is what we call a denial of service attack. So this will just render your application or API unavailable. So yep, this is how it would typically look. Although we have some form of mechanism in there, we're saying, hey, too many requests and so forth. Those requests can still come anyway. So in the next part, we are going to install Kong. Kong is an API gateway that we can use to manage our APIs. And then we'll set it up where Kong actually handles this a lot more better. And probably we can even implement things like blocking from those IP for a certain number of time and so forth. So stay with me. I will be right back. We've tested our API. We can add a user. We tested that out. That worked. We pulled the user or retrieved the user based on their user ID. That worked as well. We tested out the rate limiting function and it worked as well. It gave us the message, told us to wait for a while. Now let's move on and install Kong. Kong is an API gateway. And what an API gateway is it acts as a front to your API. It can handle things like authentication, authorization. It can even do things like blocking IP addresses that are trying to hit your API. It can handle limit rating and all those kinds of things. So this serves as a better approach to handling APIs, especially if you have multiple APIs within your environment. This serves like as that conductor that kind of routes things back and forth between those APIs and manages a lot of these things that we're concerned about security-wise a lot more effectively than trying to build them within your API itself. Now, that said, the rate limiting that we built in our API was a good start because at least if for any reason our API gateway fails somehow, we do still have some mechanism within our API itself to try and handle these things. So we're creating this defense in depth approach in terms of securing our APIs. Now let's go on. I'll move over to my Linux machine where we'll set up Kong and test that out and see how this works as well. We are back in our Ubuntu machine, and what we're gonna do is set up Kong, our API gateway, to manage the API traffic that we are testing out. So let's start by opening up Firefox, and what I'm gonna do is simply search Kong install Ubuntu, and then we'll open this link. However, we do need to set up a couple of things first, like some prerequisites to getting this set up well. And some of the things we'll need, as we did in the Windows box, we are going to use curl to run some of our commands. So let's just check to make sure some of these things are installed. We need curl and we need PostgreSQL, which is the backend database that we need to support Kong. So I'll do curl and see it says curl is not found. So I'll do a sudo apt update. And then what I'll do next is install curl, and then we'll check to see if PostgreSQL is installed as well. So when I do curl this time, what does it still says? Oh, this is the update. My apologies. So I'll do a sudo apt install curl now, and then we should be good to go. So that has taken care of curl. I'll do a curl. It should complain because I'm not passing anything. Perfect. And then now let's check to see if PostgreSQL is actually installed. If not, we'll set that up. PostgreSQL. So that is not installed. So what I'll do is in sudo apt install, and I'll do PostgreSQL, and we should have that set up as well to hit yes. All of that is good. So we do need to set up the username, database, and user on Kong, on PostgreSQL for Kong to work. What I'll do is I'll go back to our instructions, and we are, mind you, we are actually going to set up the packaged version. We're going to use the package installation. So we'll come back to these instructions. But what I am interested in now is setting up the data store as it mentions down here. So I'll open a new tab, and I'll just grab the command to set up the database and user for Kong in PostgreSQL. So we will clear this up so we can keep it up there, and then I'll go into the PostgreSQL terminal, and I'll do tag I, tag U, and Postgres, and we can hit psql, and now we're in there. So great. So I'll just right click, paste that, and that should have our database set up. So perfect. And we can do a \L to see the list of databases. And as you can see, Kong is set up now. So we are good with the prerequisites. So let's just exit out of this, and then I'll do a log out, and then we are good with that. So now let's go back to the instructions to set Kong up. So we're downloading the package. As I mentioned, we're going with the package installation. So let's grab our package manager here, grab the command here, go back into terminal, right click, paste, and it's going to complain likely about sudo. So I'm just going to fix that, hit enter. That should download the package, and I do an ls. We see that the package is actually here. So now we'll actually install this. So we'll just go back to that, grab the install command, and go in there, right click, paste. We already have sudo, so we're good. So we hit enter, and Kong should be good. It's setting it up. We have no issues there, and that's awesome. So now I'll do a clear, and if I do, one of the things we do need to actually fix is because we have Kong installed, but we need to set up some of the configuration first for Kong to actually understand what it's doing and to connect to our database. So I'll navigate to that configuration file, and then we can get that set up. So we do an ls. As you see, this is the default that Kong installation came with, but we do need to modify this. So what I'll do is just make a copy of that, just so we can keep the other one. So sudo, and then we'll do Kong. We're copying that, so I'll do Kong config, and then we'll just call it Kong.config. Perfect. And then we'll do an edit of that, and then we just need to change a few things. So it's not necessarily even changing, we're just going to comment out a couple of things that we need. So it will be mostly the proxy information and also the data store information to tell Kong where it needs to look for things. So we'll scroll all the way down. I'm looking for admin. Should get there soon. Proxy listen. We do need to uncomment this one. So proxy listen. So I'll just hit delete so that stays uncommented all the way down. We don't necessarily need to do anything with that. We can leave that default. And admin listen address, we can uncomment that as well too. We can uncomment that. We don't care about the debug for now. We can leave those. And now I think we just need to get our data store stuff set up. So let's see if we can go a little further down. Data store, I'm gonna scroll a little faster just to get to that. We'll see like databases for me. There you go. So we're in data store now. So we just need to uncomment that, and then this one and that as well. Timeout we can, but we just do it. And Kong user, these are the most important pieces. Remember we had set up that database, so we set up a password that we called super_secret. Perfect. And then a couple more things and I think we should be done. Yes, we need to tell it what database. The database was called Kong. We can leave this default. Kong will set it up, and I believe that should be it. So let me just check one more thing. Let's just make sure. Okay, I believe that's it. So I'll X out of this, hit yes, save that, and we are clear. And now to start Kong up, you simply just hit sudo Kong. Let's actually check if Postgres is running right now. So I'll do a sudo system ctl status PostgreSQL. And as you can see, Postgres is running. So we are good. So let's clear that up as well. And let's start up Kong by simply hitting sudo Kong start. And once we hit start, if all our installation and configuration worked fine, we shouldn't have any issues. It will just start up. So let's hit that. And Kong started, but it's complaining about an older database and so forth. So let's run Kong bootstrap migrations bootstrap. And we'll do a sudo and then paste that and hit enter. That should fix that. Database is up to date. You can see it down here. Database is up to date. I'll clear that up and I'll start up Kong again and we shouldn't have any issues. What I'll do is actually open up another terminal because we are going to run a bunch of curl commands to test out our API again. So I'll open this up for now, but go back to that and then I'll just do a Kong start. We shouldn't have any issues. So there you go. Kong is started with no issues. Kong is started. So our API gateway now is running. What we are going to do next is actually set up the API endpoints on Kong, which is basically the gateway that we're going to set up. And what happens is just to let you know how traffic works. So you start off, your user will start off by trying to hit your API. It actually is the Kong API endpoint that they're going to hit, and that gets redirected to your actual API, which is the user API that we created to retrieve username by ID and so forth. So I am going to set this up. Let's do that next, and then we'll check out the commands again on our curl on our API to make sure that things are working. So let's go ahead and set that up now. So let's go ahead and test this out. What I am going to do though is we did test out the API on our Windows box and it worked fine and so forth. But what I'll do is set it up here on the Linux box just to pair it up with Kong so we can do the extra testing here. So bear with me, I'll set this up real quick. We have MongoDB installed on this box already. We have Kong installed and Postgres and everything that we need as far as prerequisites. I will just create that directory and then we can go ahead and test this API out again on this Linux box, and then we'll pair it up with Kong. What we'll do is we'll create an endpoint with Kong and point our API to that endpoint. So the traffic goes this way. When a user tries to hit our API, they're actually going through the Kong API before they actually get to the API that we created. So let me just get that set up, and then we'll take it from there again. So cd documents, and then I'll make a directory, and I'll call it API security demo, just to match up with what we had. And we are good. So let's do an ls. We can see that we'll navigate into that directory API, and we are good. So what we'll need to do is actually initialize that API as well. And I've grabbed a lot of the commands just so to make it easier and quicker, so I don't have to redo all of this. So I'll just open up a text file that I created, and we'll have all our commands in there, and then we'll grab it and go with it. So let's do that. Let's go to this commands, and we already have everything installed. So I went in there. We're just gonna init that. And we are good. So that is initialized as we did. So this is very similar steps that we did in the Windows. I'm just going to run through them quickly because I'm trying to make it a lot easier, because our focus is on getting the API to work and testing out the security functionality. So I'll grab that. And in this command, what I'm doing is we're installing the same kinds of libraries and things that we needed for the rate limited and so forth, body parser, mongoose, etc. So it's essentially the same thing I'm doing here. So let me go that and add sudo install that, and we should be good. And I'll grab the next command. So we are good. So all of that installed, clear that, and I will start the application or our API. In fact, I do need to create our index file. So let me do a index.js. So notice that it's the same API I'm creating. I'm just recreating it here because it's a lot easier to just run the same thing from the same box instead of connecting to the Windows. Let me grab that. I know I have that somewhere. Let's find that. Index.js. I could have just moved it, but that's cool. I'll just copy it, and then I'll paste that in here. X that out. Yes, save that, and we're good. So now let's check if it's in there. So index.js is in there. So now let's actually start this application. So we'll do a node index.js, and now it's running. The same thing we did with our Windows box. It's running on port 3000. Now we do need to test out that API. So I'll close this out. Actually close that. Let me close this browser out. They're just all in the way. So I'll open the commands text. We need that. I'll close this out, and then I'll kind of walk through as we go through the commands just to explain what it's doing. So let me make this a little bigger. I'll go back here. So to test the API out, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create a test user with some data called some test data. So let me minimize that. We don't need this one. We'll make this a lot bigger. And in fact, let me open a new one so we can leave this running. This was the Kong one. We know we got that started. So let me open a new one, and then there we go. And we'll make that a little bigger. And I'll just do this, so we're not actually in that directory. There you go. And then what I'll do is I'll right click, paste. I just need to change a couple of things. We are actually on port 3000. This is the same thing. Nothing there. So we're just navigating to localhost because this API is actually installed on this very Ubuntu machine. So that's why we're navigating to localhost. When I hit enter, we should see our user created. So I'll hit enter, and we got our confirmation over there. So test user has been added to our database, and I'll hit enter just to get a clear screen. I'll leave that up. And our next step is to find this user by this user ID. So copy that. As always, let me actually do this first. Copy this one first. So curl, same thing. Now we're actually querying the API. So paste that. And what I'll do is replace user ID here with an actual user ID that exists in there. So we should get data back. It should give us tests. it should give us this exact information, test user, and some data. So hit enter. We got it, ID, we got username, we got test user, and test data. Perfect. That also works. So our API is working. Let's test the rate limiting and see if it blocks us. This is the rate limiting that we had implemented within our API itself. We haven't even started touching Kong yet. So let's go back there. I'll grab that real quick and we will get that input. Copy that. So now let's test out the rapid rate. I'm going to grab the code here, copy that, paste, and we simply need to change that user ID. So I'm going to grab the user ID from up here, do a copy, replace that here, and then we test this out. And this should actually start pulling the user information, but at some point it should tell us too many requests because this is the rate limiting that we implemented within our actual API. I hit enter, it's working, and now you notice it's saying too many requests, and I'm just going to stop that. So you notice it says too many requests, same thing. So our rate limiting is working. So let's now test this out with Kong. We're going to do a couple of settings in Kong, create the route, create the servers, and point our API to it, and then test it with Kong. So 1 second as we take care of that. So let's clear this up and let's grab our commands. We'll go to that, and Kong, we are actually going to create a service, and I'll copy that, paste that. So what we're doing here is we are actually creating a service named my API, and we're telling it this service is going to be at localhost port 3000, which is the API that we have running. So I will hit enter, and that is created. We can see that there's confirmation, all of that is good. So I'll leave that open, I'll keep that open, and then I'll do a curl. Now I need to create a route. So a route is basically saying if someone tries to actually hit my API, what should you do? And this is basically telling it go through Kong and then go to my API. So now we're doing the same thing here. We're just creating a route to our API in Kong, and so I'll hit enter, and that is created as well. And then I'll just hit enter so we can get a new line, and then I'll clear this up so we can see what's happening. And then I'll go back and grab a command that we are now basically adding the rate limiting to our API. So I'm saying, look, this is a service running at this route, blah blah blah, and I'm adding some rate limit, and within every 5 minutes, so forth. This is what I want it to do. If some IP address is doing too many requests, block it. I'll set up the command, and I will actually add that. Over here we're adding the rate limiting plugin into Kong. So let me do that. Copy that, paste here, hit enter, and that is also done. So I'll leave that open as well, and what I'll do is go into, and then now let's test it out. So since we had a user ID, and hopefully we didn't lose that, but let me copy this and I'll paste that. I'll go all the way back because I need that user ID. So what I'll do, actually, let me do this. This is that user ID we had. So let me copy that for now. I need that. And then I'll just do a copy and I'll paste it in here somewhere for now. I'll just paste it in here for now. So now let's try to pull that user ID. And what you'll notice is this is actually now going through Kong. You notice that we're not actually hitting our API. Let me paste the command and I'll explain it. I'll do this, clear this up, paste. And if you notice now we're saying localhost 8000, my API, we're calling user, and then we're calling a user ID, and I'll just change that user ID since we grabbed that, and I'll copy that here, copy, paste that here. Why are we now not using 3000? Because this, ideally in a real world, what will happen is we'll now point our API to this route, and anybody that's actually trying to hit the API is going through this API gateway, which is running at port 8000 on the same device. Typically, this may be a totally different server, which has a CDN setup and all kinds of things. And the API gateway handles this traffic a whole lot better in terms of testing. It can handle authentication, all of those things, authorization. Some of those features are well built into API gateways, better than you can actually build them in your own API. So it's always the great thing to run your APIs behind an API gateway. Notice that we are now calling port 8000 instead of 3000. Ideally, when that happens, we should lock the routes as far as like on our firewalls and so forth. We should lock any access to the actual API and only redirect traffic to this API gateway or through this API gateway. So let me hit enter. We should get the same results. It's just basically calling the same thing, but this time it's actually routing through the API gateway. So let's hit enter and see what happens. We hit enter, we get the same data, but this time we're routing through our API gateway. I'll go back, hit enter again, same thing. And now let's test out the rapid rate to see if that works as well. As you can see in this same command, we're actually just running a for loop and we're going through our API gateway and not our actual API. At this point, ideally your API, as I mentioned, will already be logged down or should be logged down in terms of that. So let me replace this user ID and we should get the same error. At some point it will complain that too many requests or rate limit reached. Let's grab that and we hit enter. We paste that and we hit enter and we should see what happens. So there you go. It's already complaining about the rate limit reached. As you can see, it's running and it's blocking all the requests. So if you look here, we can see API rate limit exceeded. At this point, it's likely blocking that IP address and you can't even make any request. So why is this ideal? Why did we do this two different tests to see what happens? They essentially work the same way, but this time what happens is an API gateway is designed to ideally handle these kinds of scenarios. As I mentioned, it can handle authentication, authorization, certificate management as far as exchange and so forth, like your TLS configuration. And what this does, it reduces or picks up the heavy lifting from your API or you having to code that into your API. This is why an API gateway is super important. And I'll open the logs. I'll open the Kong logs just to see if we actually did have anything in there. So I'll go to cd/user/local and Kong/logs, and we'll do an ls to see what's in there, and access logs should have that. So we'll do a cat access logs, and as you can see, everything that we requested is stored in there and so forth. So yeah, it's working. I hope that gave you some insights into APIs and application security. We covered at a high level how to set up a simple API that inputs user information and retrieves a user based on their ID. And we talked about how that could be vulnerable to a broken object level authorization if we don't implement authorization checks in the appropriate manner. And then we talked about how to use an API gateway, which is a critical piece of deploying APIs, which does the heavy lifting of authentication, authorization, and handles things like client reputation and even certificate management as far as setting up your TLS connections to your APIs. Thank you for staying with me, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.